Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes to Molly Gallivan's cottage and traditional farm, situated here in the parish of Burnin, in the picturesque southwest of Ireland. This short film tells the story of the legendary Molly Gallivan, who lived here during the last century. We look at her harsh but simple lifestyle and the farming methods in times of self-sufficiency and horsepower. But first, let's look at her native parish of Burnin, its people, and some of its amazing history. Situated amid the rugged grandeur of the Kerry Mountains, the Valley of Burnin is an area of extreme beauty, consisting of woodlands, lakes, and mountain scenery. The valley's perimeter is surrounded by the Shehy and Caha Mountains. They were formed over 250 million years ago by a great upheaval in the Earth's crust. The mountains make Burnin an ideal location for hill walking and sightseeing. Rising remote in the Caha Mountains is the River Sheen. It flows in a winding course through the centre of the valley until eventually reaching the spectacular Sheen Falls as it enters Kenmare Bay. The natural beauty of this location was the inspiration for the renowned Sheen Falls Hotel. Burnin's River Sheen is famed for its trout and salmon fishing. But it's the history of the parish that makes it so unique. Burnin has a wealth of archaeological monuments, some dating back over 5,500 years. They include Stone Age ritual sites, a Bronze Age copper mine, wedge tombs, ring forts from the Iron Age, the ruins of early Christian churches, and mass rocks from penal times. There are also many house ruins and field systems from pre-famine times, when Burnin's population was at an all-time high of 1,600 people. Today, the population of this close-knit community is roughly 250. As in Molly's day, farming is still the mainstay of its people. Burnin is located on the main road between Kenmare and Glengariff. This road was constructed in the 1830s. It gave much-needed employment to local people at a time of great poverty and hardship. Both men and women worked on the project, earning from 4 to 9 pence a day. The 4 unique hand-carved tunnels are a striking landmark in the parish. The longest of these tunnels, at the summit, marks the boundary between counties Cork and Kerry. The road, known locally as the New Line, was opened in 1842 and soon became a popular tourist route linking Glengariff and Killarney. Local traders set up small cottage industries along the route, trading some of their wares with the passing tourists. One such trader was our own Molly Gallivan. Widowed with 7 small children after the untimely death of her husband, Molly had to call on all her resourcefulness to keep body and soul together. She supplemented her meagre income by selling part of her home produce such as butter, eggs and honey at the local market. Her renowned home baking and hand-spun woolens were ever popular with the few passing tourists. But it was her illicit homemade poitín, or whiskey, known locally as Molly's Mountain Dew, that proved most profitable. Her dwelling, originally a thatched single-storey cottage, part of which still remains today, was extended, raised and slated in the early 1900s. It was home to one of Molly's descendants until 1997. Today the cottage and farm are preserved for the pleasure of visitors, to experience the simple country lifestyle before the days of electricity and modern conveniences. In the kitchen is where cooking and baking over the open fire took place, and of course, the age-old craft of butter making. Take a wander around the bedrooms and down the parlour. Then take a stroll down memory lane, a 500-metre walk through Molly's traditional farm, where you'll experience in real life the farming traditions of rural Ireland in the past. It'll give you an insight into farming life in the days of horsepower and self-sufficiency. Molly produced all her own food here on the farm. The garden gave her potatoes and other vegetables. A pig or two supplied most of the meat for the year. Apples and other fruit from the orchard were used to make jam, tarts and other niceties, while fresh honey from the hive was always a welcome treat. Molly worked most of the daylight hours out on the farm. She cared for and fed her animals and fowl, and they would reward her in return. The twice-daily task of milking her Kerry cow was ever calling. The Kerry breed were noted for their good, rich milk and would have produced up to 3 gallons a day, giving plenty of milk for the table as well as for baking and butter making. Molly washed the laundry with water from a nearby stream. The clothes were lathered with homemade soaps and scrubbed vigorously on a washboard. They were then rinsed out and laid on bushes to dry. Each season brought its own set of activities. Molly was lucky she had good neighbours who always gave a hand with the heavier work. In spring, the garden had to be prepared and set. Up to an acre of potatoes and an array of other vegetables, including turnips, onions and cabbages, were grown. Raised beds or ridges were prepared, then dressed with a coat of farmyard manure. The potato seed was carefully placed on the ridge and covered with soil. As the stalk or plant grew, further earthing was necessary to support the plant. Oats, wheat and barley were sown in late spring. Oats were grown as fodder for the horse or donkey. Wheat was ground into flour for baking. Molly used the barley as a raw material in the brewing of her poteen, Molly's Mountain Dew, which she sold in her illegal pub, called a shebeen. Her activities often attracted the unwelcome attentions of the law, and sometimes the local clergy. Late spring was also the time when turf, otherwise known as peat, was cut. Turf was the primary source of fuel for the fire. The wet turf was cut and laid on the ground to dry. When it had dried sufficiently to handle, it was stacked up into stooks, so the wind and sun could dry it completely. When dry, it was then stored in a reek until required. In early summer, the sheep were gathered in and shorn. They seemed unhappy to be relieved of their winter coats. Molly would then have carded the wool before spinning it and eventually knitting it into beautiful garments. Fine summer weather was essential for the cutting and saving of the hay. The hay was cut with a scythe or in later times a horse-powered mowing machine. Weather permitting, the hay was saved in 1 week. It was then brought in and stored in the hay shed. It provided the main supply of food for the animals over the winter months. One of the most essential jobs during the summer was the spraying of the garden to protect it from potato blight. This disease is a fungus that spreads rapidly in wet, humid weather. It attacks the stalk, eventually rotting the potato in the ground. The potato blight was the root cause of the famine in Ireland of the 1840s. Here on the farm you can visit the ghostly ruins of a family dwelling from the period of the Great Famine. Potatoes were the staple diet at the time, and when crops failed as a result of the blight, starvation, death, and emigration were the consequences. Equally, harsh landlords were ruthless in forcing poor families from their dwellings if rent was not paid. From 1845 to 1852, 1.5 million people died in Ireland from starvation, another 1.5 million emigrated. A tragic story of tragic times. Stone Age archaeology on the farm provides a link to a much earlier time. These two large flagstones that were placed and propped into position form part of a very rare ancient sun calendar and may also mark burial sites from that time. The stones are arranged to mark the sunrise position on the 21st of June, the longest day of the year. The remains of a cairn on the summit of the nearby Barabui mountain mark the sunrise on the 5th of November, which was the start of the Celtic year, and the festival of Samhain, which is now Halloween. This is only part of an amazing network of archaeological sites throughout the Burnin Valley. The Stone Circle, one of a number of ancient sites to be found in the Burnin Heritage Park, is the centrepiece of a complex astronomical calendar, including both solar and lunar cycles. Monuments on the horizon mark the rising and setting of the sun and moon on significant dates. Imaginary lines drawn from these points to the Stone Circle show that some of the monuments in the valley are on or close to these lines. The local cemetery of Drumfiachna is widely regarded as one of the oldest burial places in Ireland and almost certainly predates Christianity. Here, St. Fiachna built the first church in the parish. Adjacent to the cemetery is this unique multiple Bologna stone known locally as the Rolls of Butter. It's one of the most significant archaeological monuments in Western Europe and virtually undiscovered. After centuries of myth and speculation as to its origin, it has recently been discovered that this site was actually an ancient astronomical observatory. The Bolognes, or wells, provide a mirror image of the stars on the lower half of the constellation of Orion and two associated stars. Meanwhile, back at Molly Gallivan's, this imposing figure, which was hand-carved from the remains of a pine tree in 2002, represents the first settlers in Burnin over 6,000 years ago, the people who have left us such an amazing legacy of archaeological sites. Our Druid looks out across the valley to the highest peak, Barabui, where the cairn on the summit marks the resting place of one of his ancient chieftains. In this short film, we hope we've whet your appetite for an interesting and enjoyable visit to Molly Gallivan's cottage and traditional farm. Your entry tickets and additional information are available over in the tea room, along with information and passes for other sites in the area, including the Burnin Heritage Park. Why not enjoy some of our excellent food and home baking in the tea room? And you might like to buy some of our locally made crafts, many of which are produced here on the farm. That way, you can bring the spirit of Molly Gallivan's back to your own home.